Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce, and welcome to the Voice of Reason podcast. Today's interview is with Simon Chen, who is a pathologist located in California, somewhere. What happened with Simon Chen that brought him to my attention, well, besides Keiko in Boston, my wonderful Twitter ally, is that he had a very negative response to a particular article that was written or published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this particular article is like so many articles that I've read and broken down and seen about, where a white person goes on a tirade about all of their guilt and all of their microaggressions and their micro-racisms, and they divest themselves of all these iniquities that are due somehow to their privileged status as a white person. I'm not going to read that article. The article will be linked in the description, and it's paywalled, but it's just the same article. It's the same story that's being regurgitated over and over and over and over again. This thing is fiction, right? It's confession. And the thing about this particular confession is that it has consequences. When this narrative is implemented, where this guilt by, historical association is implemented across society, it has very negative effects. And that's why Simon Chen started to speak up, because what he saw was the same exact rhetoric and even structure of it's not an argument, but structure of narrative that he and his family experienced during the Cultural Revolution in China. And so this discussion is about his family's experience of the Cultural Revolution, which was, instigated by Chairman Mao over the 50s and the 60s, and then had consequences for China on a cultural level, on a social level, on an economic level, up to this present day. And we use that to step off and branch into conceptions of racism, which is a very hot topic, and again, a topic that I think that people need to learn how to not argue about. And I don't mean to denigrate people's experience of racism, but I do need to point out that there are ways of solving this problem that are in fact not solutions, but ways of magnifying this problem. And a lot of the rhetoric I see out there in the wild of civilization is in fact this Marxist-ish sort of oppressor-oppressive dynamic. I'm going to get out of the way. Here is Simon Chen.
My maternal grandpa was killed during the Cultural Revolution in 1966. The confession that he signed before they killed him, the structure of it, paralleled almost exactly. Paralleled this New England Journal of Medicine opinion piece almost exactly, and that's the reason why I found this opinion piece to be really troubling, right? Really morally and ethically troubling from this historical perspective that I have.
And how did it mirror that? Did it start with these non-racist acts that just slowly got bigger and bigger, or these very small iniquities that grew larger and larger? That it did seem like this woman who wrote this article and your father was trying to look for something that was bad that they could be guilty of?
Exactly.
What it was?
It's the same logical structure, right? So let me give you some context, right? So China in the late 1950s and early 1960s was in a lot of socioeconomic chaos because Chairman Mao instigated all these utopian socioeconomic reform policies, which ended up starving or killing tens of millions of people, right? And so actually, because of that, he actually lost a lot of power. He lost a lot of political power in 1959 because his credibility got destroyed, right? So he actually lost his chairmanship in 1959, but he still had a lot of unofficial political influence, right? And by the early to mid 1960s, he wanted that political power back. So what the Cultural Revolution was about was that he basically published this opinion piece calling upon the youth of China, right, to mobilize against the political leaders in power, and also all the intellectuals, all the other persons of influence in Chinese society, right, as a cultural revolution to basically restore the communist revolution. Although, as you can see, it's basically a ploy for him to get back to political power, right? And he leveraged his political influence and reputation as basically the communist liberator of China from feudalism to instigate like tens and hundreds of millions of these like red guards. Mm-hmm. They're basically social justice warriors of Mao's China, right? Because they were all basically brainwashed under the communist education system. The police and military couldn't do anything because Mao told them not to do anything. In fact, Mao told them to hand over the AK-47s to these red guards to do whatever they wanted, right? So my grandpa was working for as a researcher. He was a very educated man. He was a researcher for this aeronautical aviation intelligence research institute, right? So actually, what happened was that before the Cultural Revolution, he made a remark to a colleague in the bathroom that he thought that Mao was a dictator, right? And then by the time 1966 came around, right, when the Cultural Revolution came around, when all the red guards are just running amok on the streets, just arresting people who they thought were capitalist oppressors, right? My grandpa's colleague basically wanted his job, and so my grandpa's colleague denounced him as a counter-revolutionary who called Mao a dictator. Well, that's a correct allegation, and he denounced them. So it's like to the prison of my grandpa, right? The red guards and the police did some background investigation. They actually found out that he's a capitalist class. He's a capitalist class sympathizer because he was born to a very rich family. Of his dad was a pharmacist and a merchant who was very, very rich. Most of his family like fled to Taiwan before the communists took over China, right? So because of his family background, because of the fact that everybody else in his family is a quote unquote stinking capitalist, right? He was ultimately accused of capitalist class sympathies, right? And so not only was he this despicable counter-revolutionary who denounced the leader of the communist revolution, but he was also a capitalist class sympathizer who shared ideas of the capitalists who wanted to stop the revolution, right? Mm-hmm. So they forced them to sign a confession where basically it's the same structure as this opinion piece that we read. We were only told of the content of what it was. So basically, he said, "I'm part of a capitalist class," right? And then he brought up all these examples of supposedly capitalist class behavior. For example, he would hoard sausages. China was very poor, but because he lived in Beijing and because he worked for a very important governmental research institution, right? He got special privileges in terms of food. So they could buy like pork sausages. Like things were rationed in China too, right? Yeah. So it wasn't like you can buy like a whole box of pork sausages at once, right? So they're saving it up. They're saving it up for my mom. My mom was like, my mom was a toddler, right? And she liked them, so they were saving it up for my mom. And that was used as a example of capitalist hoarding and speculation behavior, right?
Oh, huh.
Yeah.
Never heard of speculation behavior.
So they
could sell them for a higher price later on.
Yeah, exactly, like on the black market, right? Which is totally absurd. Yeah, and so basically, it was a list of behaviors that supposedly made him a capitalist sympathizer, right? In the context of him belonging to a capitalist oppressor group, and the oppressed being the peasants and the working class. Mm-hmm. And basically, after he signed after he made that confession, right? They dragged him out onto a railroad track outside of Beijing, and then tied him down and left him to die under a running train. And we never got a body back. and afterwards, his whole family. So my mom and my grandma were both exiled out of Beijing, back to where my grandma was originally from, and now it's at. And so then that's only like 20% of the story. It's caused so much trauma and pain for my family that there's still many aspects of it that I can't ask them about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I try to. I can't ask them about it. But it is what it is, and it's just devastating. And a lot of other people suffer similar things.
Yeah, millions of people suffered under that. I'd like to hear the rest of like the story with what happened with the Red Guard, but I have a question about,
yes, sir.
Or more of a statement about how now with this article in the New England Journal of Medicine, that capitalist evil class is now construed into being whiteness. Whiteness is the new capitalist oppressor. And
absolutely,
it feels much more pernicious because with a capitalist, you can say, did they take the goods and sell the goods? With whiteness, you just look at like the basic color of somebody's skin. So basically everybody who has this going on with them is now part of this capitalist class who's participating in your oppression. And
which is totally absurd. Which is totally absurd, right? I totally agree with you, Ben. It's such a striking historical parallel.
At the same time, it doesn't rise out of the same sort of economic disparity. It actually rises out of economic prosperity. It's coming to fruition in the midst of a capitalist society who, we lose a lot of money, we gain a lot of money, we're not as rich as we used to be, but we're nowhere near China in the 50s. Not at all whatsoever. So that's the weird part of it for me. That
it's so
why
strange,
is this coming back? What is this really serving? And I guess the only answer is very either controversial or conspiracy theorist, but
it's so strange. It's so palpably absurd and strange. And somebody who hadn't even paid attention to any of these cultural war issues before last year is, especially for me, right? Especially for me as somebody who I don't see people as exemplars of their race or avatars of their race. It's just really strange that you can categorize people into a racial oppressor class.
Mm-hmm.
That's just like so detached from my own experience as an immigrant to North America, as somebody who...
When did you move?
So I moved to Canada in 1999.
Okay.
And then I moved to America. I moved to America in 2012. And so I did medical school. I did medical school in Missouri, where, we got a lot of patients. I did medical school at a major referral hospital where we got a lot of patients from not only inner city St. Louis, but also from this, rural Missouri, Illinois, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Tennessee. And a lot of these rural patients were Caucasian by race, right? And economically, they were not doing well. For me, it's just really absurd that even if you can bend people into, let's just say that even if you can bend people into racial groups, that white people are the quote-unquote oppressor class.
Why do you think that people are so susceptible to this way of thinking, though? And I want to make a sub-note because I've heard both Jewish people and Asian people as called the model minorities, which means that you're one step removed from the whiteness oppressor. What do you think about that? About this weird slippage from the whites who are oppressing everybody to anybody or any race who is getting ahead of anybody else. And it seems like a resentment, a resentment against prosperity or opportunity even.
Yeah, I think you have a point in terms of the resentment. I personally like to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
It could be resentment, could be something else. I don't know. But yeah, it's just so weird. It's just creepy that people would frame everything in terms of this identity groups, right? Like I find the model minority concept to be so toxic and
So you've come across that?
I have come across, and I think first of all, I think it's a false concept. I grew up in a working class immigrant family myself, immigrant household myself, and I knew a lot of ethnic Chinese immigrants in Canada where I grew up who were like really poor. They were on food stamps. They were on social assistance. And that just totally belies the notion of binning Asian people into a category where they're supposedly all economically very privileged. Like that has absolutely zero relation to my own lived experience as a immigrant, as a Asian immigrant, as a Chinese immigrant in North America. Getting back to your original question, right? I think racism is a individual moral catastrophe where people are not open-minded enough. People would rush to conclusions. They would take the worst 1% of a bell curve of behavior of a given quote-unquote identity group, and then use that worst 1% tail end of a bell curve to extrapolate and to make it representative of the whole group. And also, I think self-deception, right, in terms of being unable to challenge your prior conceptions of people of a given race or ethnic group. So basically, people not being open-minded enough, people extrapolating too much, and people who deceive themselves with respect to their prior misconceptions, I think, form the core basis for the individual moral problem of racism.
Yeah, but this form of racism, this form of white guilt, of like racist, like it's a racist target inversion, where you say
Exactly.
I am the racist. It goes through like this loop-de-loop of looking at large structures of why is this group over here worse off than this group over here. And you collapse this very incredibly complex social and historical apparatus into white people taking away from this other group. Well, I should try to just like whitewash the whole thing and just say Group X takes away from Group Y. Because I'm in Group X and I have all this stuff, I can't actually give anything back to these people because they're so disadvantaged on a historical, grand, structural level that all I can really do, all that's really left for me to do to correct this disparity, this inequality, this unfairness, is to flagellate myself in front of everybody. Just divest myself of pride, which it's not the same as like going and serving this community. It's more self-serving because it just makes you feel than actually serving. And that's the weird trick that's being played.
I absolutely agree with you. And that's why I think the whole concept of white guilt, which as a racial minority myself, I think it's just confusing and absurd. It does nothing to serve the interests of ethnic minorities, because fundamentally, by portraying the problem of the dual problems of racism and existing group level inequality, to portray that in a frame of a oppressor-oppressed relationship doesn't make sense, because racism, I think, is an individual moral
thing. What happened with the Red Guard?
Basically, they developed themselves. They developed themselves in the sense that you got all these Red Guards, aka the social justice warriors of Mao's China, right? Running after everybody that they think are oppressor classes. And so they eliminated all the intellectuals. They shut down all the institutions of higher education in China in the 1960s.
Right? Anybody who is prosperous.
Right. Anybody who's like intellectual or prosperous or came from a prosperous background. It's a monster, right? They eliminated all these people they were originally going after. And then who else were left, right? They were the police, the army, and themselves. Some major cities like Beijing or Shanghai were spared from this second part of the Cultural Revolution, but a lot of other parts of China were consumed in a violent civil war among the Red Guards and the army, where the army had to protect themselves from these mobs, right? Because these mobs are accusing the army of not partaking in their revolution, and therefore they're if you're not with us, you're against us, right? So that's the mentality, right?
And to go back just a little bit, the army was told not to interfere,
right?
But they weren't told to participate.
Exactly, you're exactly right. So the army was not given any orders to actively assist the Red Guard per se. But they were told to step back and not do anything, and to give the keys to the armories to these Red Guards, because obviously these Red Guards needed more than pitchforks and knives for their revolution, right? And so you got a civil war between the Red Guards and the army. You also got a civil war among the Red Guards themselves, because now you got these factions among the Red Guards that are accusing one another of not being revolutionary enough. You see how powerfully absurd this becomes, right? It's a vicious cycle, right? It's so tragic, and it's so tragic, vicious, and absurd.
Damn.
And so you see how this movement just devours itself, right? So by the late 1960s, even Mao realized that this was going out of control, right? Now that he's secured political power, he's back at the highest position in China, not formally as chairman, but he basically took the country back, right, for himself. Even he realized, even a tyrant like him realized how absurd this whole situation was, right? It was then he issued an order to the army. He issued an official order to the army to basically put this cultural revolution down as a counter-revolutionary act.
Once the Cultural Revolution had done his work for him, he decimated it, cut off its head.
It's so cynical, right?
And where's your family at this point then?
So my mom's family got exiled to where my grandma originally grew up. My grandma ironically worked as a social studies teacher, politics teacher, at a high school that she was working at. So basically, Mao died in 1976. And after the death of Mao, people in China basically began this, I would say, half-hearted or quarter-hearted attempt at rectifying the damages of the Cultural Revolution. My mom was given an opportunity to come back to Beijing, to that same institute where my grandpa, who was murdered, had worked at. And she was given another job there as like a reparation, right?
Interesting.
And that was that. And so everything settled down. We know the guy who denounced my grandpa, and like he never really crossed our mind. Like the last time we heard about him, like several years ago, like he was still alive, but obviously there's no way to bring justice, which I think is unfortunate. Like the guy who basically contributed to my grandpa's murder got his job and is now like scot-free, right? But it is what it is, right? And like that's why still.
Was there any chance to confront him, or any member of your family went and talked to him or spoke with him?
No, because as far as we're concerned, we just wanted to move on. We wanted to move on, and there's in the absence of a officially sanctioned method to bring him to hold him accountable, right? Like, what's the point?
And what prompted your family's move to Canada then?
Because my parents witnessed the Tiananmen Square Massacre in 1989. And then it was at that point that they realized that China it didn't have a viable political system to allow for a viable country for people like me to grow up in without being corrupted. By the mid-1990s, we were applying for immigration to Australia and New Zealand, but that fell through, and we ended up immigrating to Canada.
How big is your
Yeah.
family? Your immediate family?
I'm the only child, so this is my parents, myself.
Wow. And then did your parents in the transition from China to Canada, did they have to completely relearn their careers and reorganize their lives, or was there some continuity between their work in China and what they ended up doing in Canada?
My dad was very fortunate that he basically got a job in Canada in the same company, which is miraculous.
And how did you end up in America then? Just you followed your studies, you
for
followed
for
your
medical school.
yeah,
For medical school, yeah.
yeah. And what kind of medicine do you practice now, or?
I do pathology.
Okay. So
Yeah,
you learn where things are wrong,
exactly. I learn
and
about
you
where
point
things
them
are
out.
wrong
You say,
from.
"This is the problem."
Exactly, you got that exactly right. Both somatic and I guess now also psychosocial.
Yeah, it's very interesting. One aspect of this story that's very
Hmm.
interesting, and I'm incredibly moved by your family's story. That's it's very emotional for me. But one of the things that's weird is that
Hmm.
I guess this is implicitly racist, but China as a whole is much more homogenous than America is. And by that, I mean that there's so many different ways for this way of thinking to fracture the relationship between people in America than
Right.
there were in China. But I'm sure that there's a lot of different clans or different ethnicities and sub-ethnicities within China. But the way that China was broken apart by a bad actor, being Mao, was
Hmm.
along like a socioeconomic framework. That's what
Right.
how it was shattered. America is much more vulnerable to that
Right.
because we have all these different ways of identifying and putting stress on
Right.
identity.
Hmm.
How do you see multiculturalism working where people can maintain their differences and converge on similarities and harmony can happen within between all these different races and classes and genders and all this other stuff?
Just treat people as individuals. Just don't reduce individuals down into exemplars or avatars of whatever identity group that suits people's fancy, right? Because there's a lot greater intra-group variation than there is intergroup variation, right? So if you represent each group along some axis of behavior or whatever, right, on a bell curve, then all the bell curves for the different groups are going to extensively overlap. So then, I think about things very mathematically, right? Because my undergrad background is in chemistry, in the physical sciences, right? I think about things logically, let's say, which I don't think it's a common attribute among the social activists. Yeah, but if you can bend people, even if you can bend people into identity groups, but you find out that these people in identity groups are a lot more diverse than the groups are different from one
Okay.
another.
Okay.
Then you
So
realize,
yeah.
you can't generalize people, right?
So what you're basically saying is that within any given identity group, there's more diversity between the individuals in that group than between any other identity group. No matter
Right.
what axis of identity you use, there's always going to be a
Absolutely.
lot more difference because the
Right.
complexity of the individual is much more
Right.
paramount than any way that we categorize that individual.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that's a very reasonable postulate. That postulate definitely has been 100% consistent with everything that I have seen in my life. Again, something I said on Twitter was that racism is a individual moral catastrophe that can affect people of any skin color, right? And in fact, I think reducing racism to a problem of white versus black does a horrible disservice in our fight against racism because it simply fails to address the problem of racism among anybody who's not Caucasian. That is so ignorant that I think it's does a real disservice to both our fight against racism, which I detest, and also to achieve common multiracial, multicultural understanding, as a common understanding that racism is a abomination among all of us.
Yeah,
that we all need to put conscious individual effort into to fight against.
Mm-hmm. And
right?
the weird trick about making the white people the bad guy is that the white people learn to be humble, to consider things. They have to spend so much more extra, let's say, processing power on the social interaction that they get better and better as people. Like, it privileges them in this weird way by breaking them down. It puts them under more stress, forcing them to be better people, and then giving everybody else the ability to not really grow in that way. It's just this weird kind of privileging or reprivileging of the person. That's it's very self-serving at the same time as being self-flagellating.
Like, some people can't even believe it when I tell them that, I think America is a lot less racist as a country than China is, because, China is like, vast majority of it are like Han Chinese, but there are ethnic Tibetans, right, who live in Tibet, and there are ethnic Uyghurs who live in the western part of China. That's, you heard about concentration camps, right? And there's a lot of There's basically a network of concentration camps for Muslim Uyghurs in Western
active
China.
right now.
Like right now, which is absolutely horrible, ridiculous, obscene, and illegal, right? It helps to illustrate my point that there's a lot of racism in China, and there are many Han Chinese racists who discriminate against visible minorities in China, right? Basically my point being is that if we see racism, racism is both a national problem here and a global problem, right? And if we want to tackle racism as a global problem, then framing racism in the context of a Caucasian oppressed relationship, it fails to address the palpable and the devastating racism that exists among people of other racial groups, like in China.
So the best fight against racism isn't to turn the racism against yourself, but to actually not be racist.
Exactly. As an individual,
to actually make connections with somebody of another race.
Absolutely. Like, just stop. First of all, just stop being an asshole, right? Stop being an asshole.
Yeah, that's really hard for people. You have to understand.
Apparently,
it's not easy. I mean, one, it's really difficult not to be an asshole.
Right.
But secondly, it takes a lot of education, nuance, patience, humility to not categorize people into stereotypes, to really see the world as it is, as a bunch of fractured complexities. And that takes a lot of processing power, or perhaps it doesn't take so much of this, but more of this. It takes more of that.
Exactly. I agree with you, both the heart and the mind, right? We have to open up our hearts and minds. And I think, obviously as adults, we can, open up our hearts and minds, right? But I think it's also really important for parents to model that behavior for their kids, because like, using myself as an example, right? Like, my parents, like, neither of my parents are like racists at all. My own attitudes towards race came about from their open-mindedness. Their open-mindedness, their willingness to be nice to people from all races, all cultures, keep an open mind, don't hold historical animosities against other people. Everything, I think, ultimately should happen from childhood, right? I think as a society, if we want to fight racism as a problem over this century, right, which we have to do, then we have to start by being good parents.
Being role models, like you're saying.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Simon. What's next on your plate? Are you done with school, and do you have a practice now?
I'm still in training. But we'll see where life takes me.
Okay, and
afterwards.
you say you're a pathologist. What
Yeah.
kind of domain of pathology have you specified in your studies? Or is it just you look where the problem is and you go there?
So pathology is a really broad field,
Yeah.
And there's
Because there's
different.
so many problems.
Yeah. So a lot of people, pathology used to be about doing autopsies on people.
Oh, okay.
Now that autopsies are becoming more and more uncommon, most of the work of a pathologist are either in processing tumor tissue
Okay.
from a operating room and diagnosing cancer and other diseases using surgical tissue, or running a medical laboratory. So the former is called surgical anatomic pathology, and the latter is called clinical pathology. And currently, I see myself more in anatomic pathology.
All right. Poking at things, tissues and stuff.
Yeah. Processing tissues, cut them into microscope size, look at them under a microscope, and diagnose people's cancers or other diseases. Yeah.
That's fascinating stuff, and a lot of work, I bet.
It is a lot of work, but I love it. I think, you just got to find meaning in what you do.
Well, thanks a lot, Simon. I'll let you know when
Thank
this
you.
comes up, and
Great.
keep on speaking out. You're bringing a
Okay.
great perspective to
Thank
the
you.
discourse. It's really
Right.
important.
I hope so too.
All right.
All right.
Have a good night. Bye.
Yeah, you too. Bye.